This is the story of a ghost that haunted a Welsh castle for some considerable years, back in the deep, dark depths of history. It's one of those ghostly tales where a spirit from the past needed the help of the living to pass on to the hereafter. There are many different versions of the story, and in the local area it's widely believed to be absolutely true. So I'll tell you about it, and you can decide for yourselves. The castle was dark and gloomy, and if ever there was a house that looked as if it should be haunted, this was it. Built of red sandstone, it was a great frowning fortress with turrets, dungeons, and a myriad of dark corners that any self-respecting phantom would be pleased to inhabit. Our story was recorded by a Methodist preacher who had heard it first-hand from a most unlikely member of his flock. She was an elderly spinster, dreadfully poor, but extremely God-fearing and religious, definitely not the type of person to see spooks lurking in closets or prone to wild imaginings. There'd been trouble at the castle for as long as anyone could remember. Each lord to inherit the property had for generations suffered terrible financial hardship, and of the few servants that were employed there, the amount that had fled after just a matter of days, vowing never to cross the threshold again, was alarmingly high. This particular Christmas, the then young lord had packed up his family and headed for London to enjoy the festive season, leaving a skeleton staff of the steward, his wife, and a handful of servants to mind the castle. To help out with some of the sewing, the steward's wife had engaged the services of the poor old spinster for a temporary term. The steward and his wife had often suspected that the ghost could simply be the pranks of the other servants, so they decided to try an experiment. Knowing the devout nature of the old lady's beliefs, they were sure that if she saw the ghost, then they could accept the story as the truth. There was one room in the castle that was never used, because it was seemingly haunted. Anyone who had attempted to sleep there had usually fled after only a few hours, complaining of screaming and banging noises, a chilling cold wind, even on the hottest of nights, and a sensation of strangulation that left even the bravest soul quaking in their boots for many months and sometimes years to come. The steward and his wife decided to put the old lady in this bedchamber, and when night fell the poor soul was astonished to be shown to this grand, lavishly furnished room. There was a fire burning in the grate, and as the steward's wife bade her good night, the woman prepared for sleep in the massive, curtained four-poster that dominated the room. After saying her prayers, she climbed into bed, and by the light of a flickering candle, started to read a few verses from her Bible. When she heard the door open, at first she was not alarmed, and as she pulled open the heavy brocade curtains, she expected to see the steward's wife returned for some reason. Nothing could have prepared her for the dark, menacing-looking man that stood at the foot of the bed. He was dressed in fine clothing, with lace at his throat and wrists, and he stood with his arms folded across his strong body, with a stance that seemed to be asking a question. The old woman was instantly petrified to the spot, still clutching her Bible, her lips muttering involuntary prayers to the Almighty to save her. The apparition appeared to become angrier than ever, and turning on his well-shod heel, he left the room. The good woman took a deep breath, and realizing that the man was obviously a ghost, fell to her knees by the bedside to pray for strength. She resolved to speak to the man should he return, because although she was terrified, she knew in her heart that he had something to say. It was only a matter of moments before he reappeared. "Sir," she cried, "pray who are you, and what do you want?" The ghost pointed. "Take up thy candle and follow me. I'll tell you what to do." Still terrified, the woman did as she was told, and the ghost led her out of the room and along a boarded passageway until they reached a small door, which the ghost opened. "Go inside," said the ghost. But seeing the fear on the poor woman's face, he added in a softer tone, "I'll not hurt you. I need your help. Watch me carefully." With this, he started to pull up the floorboards, revealing a large box with a rusty iron handle. He said, "Do you see the box?" And the old woman replied that she did. He then called her over to a crevice in the wall where a small key lay covered in dust and cobwebs. "This box and the key must be sent to his lordship in London. It is of the utmost urgency. Do not allow anyone else to look inside. It is for his eyes only." His warning was stern, and the old woman nodded, agreeing to his bidding. "Do this," he murmured, "and I will trouble this house no more." Within a heartbeat, he was gone. And having heard footsteps, the steward and his wife appeared in the passageway, surprised to see the old lady in her nightclothes, holding a torn-up floorboard, peering down into a dark hole. She told her story with remarkable composure, and the steward quickly pulled up the old box and put the key with it to despatch to London the very next day. The entire household then returned to their beds, and the old lady enjoyed the most luxurious night's sleep she had ever had in the big, high-curtained bed. No one knows what was in the box. Could have been money, jewels, or family papers, because it proved to be the best Christmas gift that the young lord had ever received. He and the family quickly returned to the castle, never suffering from financial difficulties again. The old woman was given a permanent position, sewing for the household, and was allowed to sleep in the grand bedchamber for as long as she lived. The ghost was true to his word. He never troubled the occupants of the castle again, and what's more, there's never been a ghostly presence of any description reported since. Who would have guessed that a Christmas box from a ghost could have brought so many seasonal blessings, particularly to the little old lady who had shown such courage and presence of mind, helping a wandering spirit to finally rest in peace. What could be more traditional at Christmas time than a nativity scene, complete with shepherds, wise men, a heavenly host, lowing cattle, donkeys, sheep, Mary and Joseph, and of course the baby Jesus in a manger. Even in an ever-changing multicultural society, celebrating the birth of Christ is a vital part of modern Christmas festivities, and perhaps the truest reminder of this being a time of peace on earth and goodwill to all men. It's hard to believe that such a source of inspiration could also be such a source of conflict throughout the 2,000 plus years since the birth of Christ. But it's a sad, sad fact that more wars have been fought over religion than anyone can actually remember, and there are still times, even today, when just being of a particular faith can mean the difference between living and dying. Welcome to Harvington Hall, a seemingly beautiful and tranquil Elizabethan manor house in the heart of the English countryside. But ask anyone in the local area about the hall, and the first thing that they'll all mention is the ghosts. Question further, and no one will be able to tell you who the ghosts are or name a specific spectral incident, but the certainty of their existence is unquestioned. Step inside, and it's immediately evident that this is no ordinary house. It's steeped in mystery and full of priest holes from a time when being a Catholic was high treason and the penalty was death. This is one of the few places in England that can claim to have had continuous Catholic worship here for at least 4 centuries. The darkest days for the Catholics at Harvington came during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. Her father, Henry VIII, had made himself head of the Church of England when the Pope had refused to give him a divorce from the first of his 6 wives. By the time Elizabeth became queen, many powerful Catholics wanted to restore England to their faith, and because she was afraid that they were plotting to kill her, she made it illegal for priests to say Mass or for anyone to hear it. The punishment was death, and being a Roman Catholic during this period of English history was a dangerous business. Humphrey Packington was in residence at Harvington during these troubled times. A devout Catholic, he employed the services of master priest hole builder Nicholas Owen to create some of the most remarkable hiding places to offer sanctuary to travelling priests. This priest hole is in the withdrawing room, and to really understand what it was like to be shut away in a hide, sometimes for days or even weeks at a time, you need to know what would have happened to any priest who got caught. It also goes some way to explaining why there's such an atmosphere of suspense throughout this house. There's a popular children's nursery rhyme. Goosey, goosey gander, whither shall I wander, upstairs and downstairs, in my lady's chamber? There I met an old man who wouldn't say his prayers, so I took him by the left leg and threw him down the stairs. This nursery rhyme is thought to have been based upon the practice of searching out priests, when groups of men who were little more than bounty hunters would rampage through a house, tearing up floorboards and causing mayhem in order to find what they were looking for. It wasn't that they held strong religious beliefs, it was just that if they caught a priest, the house and lands of the place where he was hiding could be claimed as their prize. Can you imagine crouching in the dark, hearing every noise and movement as the hunters got closer and closer to your hiding place? Would they find you? Would they pass you by? A terrifying experience, even for a man of God. Unfortunately, matters were made far worse, as there was a complex network of priests being shipped into England from Europe, and if a priest was captured, then he could be tortured to give up the names of his associates. His usefulness at an end, the poor man would then be hung and usually drawn and quartered as a grisly example to others. The priest holes at Harvington are some of the finest surviving examples of their kind. This room is known as Dr. Dodd's Library, named after the 18th century priest, also an accomplished historian who spent many years working at Harvington. If you look for loose floorboards, you'll be looking in completely the wrong place. There's a raised platform that used to be panelled and lined with books. A closer look at one of the timbers will reveal a secret hiding place disguised most effectively. The skilled engineering required to make the beam pivot no doubt saved the lives of many priests. The only priests we actually know about are the ones who got caught. Those that escaped would have without doubt taken the secrets of Harvington to their graves. Moving on through the house, following this ghostly trail, you'll come to a tiny little chapel with a remarkable atmosphere. There's nothing ornate, just simple wooden furniture with the light from the tiny window illuminating the painted drops of blood and water symbolising Christ's Passion which decorate the walls. Outside, the wonderfully uneven passageway leads on to further secrets, but is worthy of investigation. The faint line drawings date back centuries, and when fully painted would have looked spectacular. As you walk into the marble room, so called because of the ancient paint effects on the walls, it's again tricky to work out where the priest hole might be. Everything, as elsewhere, looks perfectly solid. Here's a clue. This fireplace has no chimney. Look skywards and you'll see a concealed ledge. This is a marvellous fake. If the priest still felt unhappy, he could climb into the roof space where there are a number of attic hides for greater protection. It would be difficult to move through any space in this house without feeling that someone is there with you. Never more true than when you walk up and down the staircase, and it's not only because of creaking floorboards. This entire section of staircase lifts to reveal a very spacious priest hole. There's a further secret door which leads to an inner hiding place. It would certainly have accommodated more than one priest, which was sometimes the case. Nicholas Owen, the man who had ingeniously devised these hides, was actually captured with a priest at Hindlip House, very close to Harvington, which no longer stands. After 4 days in hiding, with only an apple between them, they were found, and Nicholas Owen was caught in a priest hole of his own making. He didn't survive for long, dying while being tortured. His colleague fared little better, surviving until his execution. Walking out of the house after our ghostly tour of Harvington Hall, the beautiful gardens feel remarkably peaceful. But beware, there's a very different type of ghost that occasionally appears here. In 1710, a local witch, Mistress Hicks, was hanged at a crossroads close to Harvington. It's said that she cast a spell that made women and children vomit pins. Perhaps she's still protesting her innocence, or alternatively, if she has a troubled conscience, she might be in search of absolution from the ghostly priests who undoubtedly reside within the walls of this truly exceptional, carefully preserved building. There is no author more associated with Christmas than Charles Dickens. Whether it be his evocative descriptions of families and friends gathered around the glowing fire to celebrate the seasonal festivities, or his great ghostly Christmas carol, where timeless spirits teach a mean old miser the true meaning of Christmas. The story of Ebenezer Scrooge proved to be incredibly popular, and Dickens began a tradition of publishing a ghost story each Christmas. The tales tend not to be as well known as his major works, but The Haunted Man and Number 1 Branch Line The Signalman are well worth looking out for, and of course, where Dickens led, others followed, with many of his contemporaries also writing Christmas ghost stories which the Victorians were very partial to. Not surprising then that stories of the ghost of Charles Dickens have grown over the years, but in quite unexpected places. Rather than walking the lofty streets of London or amongst the hushed worshippers at Westminster Abbey where he's actually buried, his spirit seems to prefer the ancient Medway town of Rochester and the surrounding area where Dickens lived for much of his life. In his later years, Dickens was rich and successful, arguably the most successful English writer of all time. But he never forgot what it had been like to be poor, especially as a child, and some of his greatest works, including David Copperfield and Great Expectations, contain a bleak picture of his early life. The fact that he wrote about his personal experiences makes it possible to track down many of the actual locations that inspired him, and for anyone on the trail of Charles Dickens' ghost, a closer look at the events that marked the great author's childhood will prove to be very revealing. When Charles Dickens was 5 years old, his father found work in the Navy Pay Office at the Royal Dockyard at Chatham. The family moved into what was then number 2 Ordnance Terrace, where they spent 5 relatively happy years. Next door, Charles had a great friend who is thought to have been the model for James Steerforth in David Copperfield, and many of his larger-than-life characters can be traced back to this time. The Dickens family lived constantly on the verge of financial ruin and were forced to move to the more frugal 18 St Mary's Place, Chatham, in 1821. Although they struggled on for a few more years, with Charles at least getting a little schooling, disaster struck in 1824. Charles's father was arrested for debt and sent to the Marshalsea, a notorious debtor's prison, with Mrs. Dickens and the children going with him. Charles was sent to work at a blacking factory, and the humiliation and despair that he felt even at such a young age was a memory that was never to leave him. The story is well told in David Copperfield, with his wonderful character Mr. Micawber, based fondly upon Dickens's own financially embarrassed father, giving these very wise words of advice. Annual income, £20. Annual expenditure, 19, 19 and 6. Result, happiness. Annual income, £20. Annual expenditure, £20 ought and 6. Result, misery. What happened next was truly the stuff of storybooks. A timely legacy came to the rescue of the Dickens family. His father was able to leave prison, and Charles was able to return to his studies at a school in Hampstead. For young Charles Dickens, fortune had indeed smiled, and the streets of London quickly proved to be paved with gold. At the age of 15, he became a junior clerk in a solicitor's office, spending a brief time there before turning to journalism, although legal matters were to provide popular themes for many of his novels. He soon progressed, and as a successful writer, married Catherine Hogarth in 1836, returning to the Rochester area for his honeymoon. It was the year that the Pickwick Papers first appeared, and his fortunes rapidly improved yet again. Oliver Twist and Nicholas Nickleby quickly followed, with A Christmas Carol published in 1843. And by 1850, Dickens had reached the height of his literary fame, with the publication of his own favourite, David Copperfield. Dickens never actually claimed this to be his greatest novel, but he did say that it was the one that he liked best. As a child, Charles Dickens had been fascinated by a house that he loved to walk past high up on Higham Hill. It was close to Rochester, and he and his father would stop outside Gad's Hill Place and dream of what life would be like in such a grand house, with plenty of money and servants to do your every bidding. It was a dream that came true for Charles Dickens, as he was able to fulfil this ambition, buying Gad's Hill in 1857. A friend gave him a Swiss chalet which he put up in the grounds, and it was where Dickens liked to work. Unfortunately, there was a busy road between Gad's Hill Place and the peaceful chalet, so Dickens built a tunnel so he could reach his destination with no disturbance. The tunnel can still be seen to this day, and the chalet has been preserved in the gardens of the Dickens Centre in Rochester. Gad's Hill Place was the only house that Charles Dickens ever owned, and he remained there until his death in 1870. The house is today a school, and although there is a strong Dickensian atmosphere, the reported sightings of the great man's ghost actually centre around the town of Rochester. Rochester has a castle that is one of the best preserved Norman fortresses in England. Also, the beautiful cathedral is predominantly Norman, marking the rich historical significance of this remarkable town. There's a graveyard in Rochester Cathedral Moat, the ancient burial ground of St. Nicholas, and it was here that Dickens had expressed a desire to be buried. But by the time of his death he was famous the world over, and Westminster Abbey was considered to be a far more fitting location for his mortal remains. As well as being spotted here, Charles Dickens' ghost has also been seen on many occasions walking along Rochester's Victorian High Street, passing buildings that he immortalised in his writing. This is Restoration House, forever famous as the home of Miss Havisham in Great Expectations. Before Dickens wrote about the house, it was best known as the place where Charles II stayed on his way back to London from exile in France, to be restored to the English throne as king, explaining why the house still bears its unusual name. The Royal Victoria is a coaching inn over 400 years old. Previously known as the Bull, but renamed after the then future Queen Victoria stayed here in 1836. Dickens featured this inn as the Bull in the Pickwick Papers, and changed its name to the Blue Boar in Great Expectations. Another interesting building is the Corn Exchange, dating back to the 17th century. It has a wonderful moon-faced clock featured in a less well-known work of Dickens, The Uncommercial Traveller. Chertsey's Gate is featured in the novel that Dickens was working on at the time of his death, as were the charming 18th century houses of Minor Canon Row. The book was a mystery concerning the disappearance of Edwin Drood, and there have been many attempts by various authors since to complete the novel. On the very day that Charles Dickens died, quite suddenly from a stroke, he was seen staring through the gates of Restoration House, perhaps looking for inspiration yet again to finish The Mysteries of Edwin Drood. Who can guess what Dickens had in store for Edwin Drood? The character had disappeared and was presumed murdered when the story was left unfinished. Undoubtedly there would have been an ingenious twist in the tale, but one thing's for certain, unless his ghost ever decides to speak, nobody will ever know. There's no denying the fact that this area of Gloucester, the Westgate end of the ancient city, has more than its fair share of ghostly tales and strange happenings. Many of the tall, narrow buildings, now predominantly shops and offices, claim the presence of ghosts and poltergeists. Tucked down one narrow lane is the little house immortalised by Beatrix Potter in The Tailor of Gloucester, and it's easy to imagine a cold Christmas Eve when, as legend has it, the animals could speak, and the tiny mice in the tailor's house scurried around to exquisitely embroider a waistcoat for the poor sick tailor, so that it would be ready for the Mayor of Gloucester's wedding on Christmas Day. This beautiful old church, just off Westgate Street, St Mary de Lode, also has a Christmas tale to tell. Many centuries ago, the priest who looked after the church set out on a pilgrimage to Rome, but promised faithfully that he would return to his congregation to celebrate Mass on Christmas Eve. Sadly, he was shipwrecked and perished. But on Christmas Eve, a gale swept through the church, returning the ghost of the priest to keep his word. For many years, his restless form was often seen in the church, particularly at Christmas time. It wasn't until some considerable time later, when a compassionate clergyman took Holy Communion with the priest's ghost at midnight on Christmas Eve, that the spirit was finally laid to rest, never to be seen again, having eventually fulfilled his promise. Behind the church is St Mary's Square, and the imposing monument to Bishop John Hooper, burned at the stake, a martyr to his religious beliefs in the reign of Queen Mary, daughter of King Henry VIII. It's said that because he was prevented from preaching a final sermon, he prayed out loud continually throughout his ordeal, his courage and strength amazing the large crowd that had gathered to see the spectacle. There's an eerie feeling here that is hard to explain, and even without the presence of a ghost, the atmosphere that lingers is decidedly haunting. Our next port of call is often still referred to as Bishop Hooper's Lodgings, a timber-framed Tudor building dating back to the beginning of the 16th century. These black and white houses have had many uses over the years, ranging from the manufacture of various products through to being a fishmonger's and an undertaker's. Now appropriately the city's folk museum, it houses some remarkable exhibits and a fascinating collection of ghost stories to thrill those who come to visit. As you enter the museum and start to climb the creaking stairs, there's a distinct feeling of travelling back in time, and when you finally reach the top of the building, you'll find yourself transported to a period of history when children laboured in garrets for pennies to put even more money into rich men's pockets. This is where pins were made, an industry that had been established in Gloucester since the 14th century. This property was customised for the purpose when a pin maker named John Tilsey was granted the house by the mayor of the city along with £200 and 30 boys in 1626. The work was well suited to the small hands of children, and of course the wages could be kept to a minimum. Pins were made from locally available coiled brass, which was straightened and cut into short lengths to be sharpened at one end. The pin heads were twisted like a spring, and after heating in a furnace which still dominates the room today, were plunged red-hot, steaming and spitting into cold water. A heavy pedal-driven ram would then attach the head to the shank, after which the pins were cleaned, tinned and polished before being stuck into papers for sale. The children were often very young, trooping up the rickety stairs at daybreak to work until dark in what must have been a very claustrophobic environment. The skylights were added to help the children see better and work more efficiently, not to make their lives more comfortable. If they became tired and slow, the foreman would scold and often strike the child to make them work faster. At least the warmth from the furnace in winter was a blessing, for many children died of disease and malnutrition. And as you stand high up among the rafters, you can't help feeling that at least a few youngsters must have died in this very room, struggling to keep working to help provide extra income for their families. The only trace of their passing can be seen if you look very carefully down between the floorboards. Shiny pinheads are still lodged there, a constant memorial to the pin factory children. This ghost story happened quite recently in the museum when a custodian arrived to open up as usual. As he climbed the creaking stairs, a noise that he was well used to, he heard a strange sound. It was as if a heavy wheel was turning. When he reached the top of the building, as we've seen where the pin factory children used to work, he heard the sound again. It appeared to be coming from the neighbouring section, featuring agricultural equipment. As he moved into the room, his attention was immediately drawn to a huge wheel, normally locked solid, turning of its own accord. It turned firstly to the left 3 times, and then equally deliberately to the right 3 times. He couldn't believe his eyes. He desperately tried to come up with a logical explanation, but nothing sprang to mind. What he was witnessing was impossible. The wheel was far too heavy to move by itself. What's more, it was as if someone was playing a game with it, rather than it having been jolted and moving with the momentum. There was no question of anyone else being there. It was early, and he knew he was completely alone. Shaking with fear, he ran down the stairs, taking some time to recover from the experience. Perhaps the workers of the past were playing tricks upon the workers of the present, because this is not the only incident of this kind. All of the things that happen are more mischievous than malevolent, which is probably what you'd expect from the ghosts of the pin factory children, who were never given the chance to play when they laboured such long hours here so many years ago. The children are not the only ghosts to inhabit the building, though. Another custodian had quite a different encounter while manning the reception desk on a horrible wet winter afternoon. Hearing the clatter of someone running down the narrow flights of stairs, he was alarmed to see a lady visitor trying to make a very speedy exit from the building, coat and umbrella flying in all directions. Concerned that something dreadful had befallen the poor soul, he ran after her to see if he could do anything to help. As she gasped to get her breath back, she told him that she'd seen a ghost, a man dressed as a woman. Despite his pleas for more details, the lady ran off into the dusky evening, and the young man was left wondering if the ghost might have been a monk. This part of Gloucester is, after all, dominated by the magnificent cathedral, where so much history has taken place throughout the ages, which may go some way to accounting for the incredible atmosphere the Westgate end of the city is now famous for, even if such mysterious happenings as we've heard about today can never be truly explained. For the majority of people, when you mention ghosts, their first thought is of a haunted house. But not all ghosts are of the indoor variety, as country folklore proves, packed with tales of haunted heaths, woodland witches, and spectral travellers along rambling roads. There are also many stories of strange happenings connected with crossroads, particularly bleak and now deserted spots where stage coaches once thundered through under sweating horsepower. Some interesting suggestions have been made as to why crossroads tend to be associated with ghostly apparitions, usually dating back to more ancient times. It was the practice of many rural communities to bury murderers, witches and people who had committed suicide at crossroads, thrusting a wooden stake through the body to prevent any spirits from wandering. However, the more likely explanation, and certainly the reason behind the ghostly tales we're about to look at, is the fact that crossroads were often places of execution. Notorious highwaymen and other miscreants were hung from crossroads gallows and gibbets to discourage others from such criminal activities, and to this day it is only the brave that ever stop at these crossroads after nightfall. It's been many years since anyone was executed at this crossroads, a no-man's land where cattle tracks met stagecoach routes centuries ago. Now a quiet country road, there still remains a sinister atmosphere, completely justified if the local ghost stories are to be believed. Hidden away, down in these woods, there used to stand a stone cottage where a hangman once lived with his son. The hangman's tragic ghost has often been reported wandering through the woods and up to the crossroads, a route that he would have taken almost nightly to carry out his gruesome trade. This story has been handed down through generations of country folk and has no doubt been used on occasion as a stern warning to any wayward youngster. It was a wet, windy winter's night, just a few days before Christmas. The clouds were thick and black, obscuring the watery moon, blanketing the woods in darkness. A knock came at the hangman's door as two lawmen delivered up a squirming, shivering youth to hanging. Swiftly the hangman set about his task, leading the short walk to the gallows. Familiar with his work, the hangman regularly used no lantern, giving anonymity to his condemned culprits. It was only when his work was complete that he looked up at the lifeless corpse hanging from the noose as a ray of moonlight illuminated the scene through a chink in a passing cloud. The hangman said nothing, as he instantly recognized the dead, twisted gaze of his own son, until then concealed by the black of the night. Without a word to his companions, he returned to his cottage, drove a huge hook into a wall, and hung himself. From that day forward, no one would ever live in the cottage again, and it gradually fell into rack and ruin, leaving the sad spirit of the hangman to walk through the woods and over the crossroads for all eternity. If you were to come here on New Year's Eve, however, it would be a very different apparition that might cross your path. There was once a terrible stagecoach accident here, and the ghostly form of a phantom silver-grey coach and horses has been reported charging past the crossroads on the stroke of midnight. The noise is, by every account, blood-curdling, as harnesses snap, passengers scream, and horses cry out in terror as they hurtle to their deaths. Incidentally, the tales of this ghostly experience are always second-hand, because legend has it that anyone who sees the coach and dares to speak of it will be forever cursed. Who knows whether there is any truth in the story, but one thing's for certain: there are few people who would choose to miss out on New Year's Eve festivities, to stand shivering upon this bleak stretch of heathland to wait for a phantom coach to arrive. This next crossroads is again set high upon risen ground, where a number of roads meet, which centuries ago made it an ideal location for gallows and gibbets to serve as a deterrent. It was the place of execution for Tom Long, a famous highwayman whose cries of "Stand and deliver!" terrorized the travellers of this area for a considerable period of time. In recent years, a family were picnicking close by, as this has now become a very popular local beauty spot. As the children were busily enjoying their picnic tea, their mother looked around to see the figure of a highwayman sat astride a huge horse, staring down at her in a menacing fashion. Concerned for the safety of her children, she turned back, ready to protect them, but they were oblivious to any danger, having seen nothing, and as she glanced back over her shoulder, the vision had disappeared. This could well have been the ghost of Tom Long, who not only materialises here, at the place where he is said to have died, but also along many of the roads that proved so lucrative during his lifetime. Stories of highwaymen always prove popular, full of romance, fueling the modern-day imagination, and perhaps this accounts for the endurance of the legend of Tom Long, which has become so much a part of regional folk history, encouraged by each new generation of storyteller, making this a ghostly tale that will never be allowed to die. As we come to the end of our collection of Christmas ghost stories, how could we finish without remembering the greatest seasonal ghost story of all time, A Christmas Carol by Mr. Charles Dickens. Ebenezer Scrooge was a mean old miser who thought that Christmas was nothing but humbug. "If I could work my will," said Scrooge indignantly, "every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart, he should." This is not a good start to the Christmas festivities, particularly for Scrooge's poor clerk, Bob Cratchit, who has a wife and family he would like to be with on Christmas Day. He also has a crippled son, Tiny Tim, who is very ill and might not live to see another Christmas. When Scrooge is alone in his bed, he's visited by the ghost of his dead business partner, Jacob Marley, who is wrapped in chains, weighed down with his burdens. The chain he drew was clasped around his middle. It was long and wound about him like a tail, and it was made, for Scrooge observed it closely, of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. Marley had come to warn Scrooge that if he didn't change his ways, he would end up in the same predicament. 3 spirits then visit Scrooge, the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future, who show him what he must do to save himself and others around him. The first spirit appeared like a child, dressed in white, carrying fresh green holly. "Who and what are you?" Scrooge demanded. "I am the ghost of Christmas past." "Long past?" inquired Scrooge, observant of its dwarfish stature. "No, your past." The ghost takes Scrooge back to when he was a boy and reminds him of how he lost out on love. "Spirit," said Scrooge in a broken voice, "remove me from this place." "I told you these were shadows of the things that have been," said the ghost, "that they are what they are. Do not blame me." "Remove me!" Scrooge exclaimed. "I cannot bear it." The second ghost is the spirit of Christmas present, who takes Scrooge to see Christmas at Bob Cratchit's house, where Tiny Tim is failing fast. He sat very close to his father's side, upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his, as if he loved the child, and wished to keep him by his side, and dreaded that he might be taken from him. "Spirit," said Scrooge with an interest he had never felt before, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live." "I see a vacant seat," replied the ghost, "in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die." "No, no," said Scrooge. "Oh, no, kind spirit, say he'll be spared." A definite change of heart for Mr. Ebenezer Scrooge, and by the time the ghost of Christmas yet to come arrived to take Scrooge to see his own grave, the old miser is resolved to change his ways. He immediately sets out to make amends to all, and especially to his faithful servant Bob Cratchit, hoping against hope that he will be in time to save Tiny Tim. "A Merry Christmas, Bob!" said Scrooge with an earnestness that could not be mistaken, as he clapped him on the back. "A merrier Christmas, Bob, my good fellow, than I have given you for many a year. I'll raise your salary, and endeavour to assist your struggling family." Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all, and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city knew, or any other good old city, town, or borough in the good old world. He had no further intercourse with spirits, but lived upon the total abstinence principle ever afterwards. And it was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well, if any man alive possessed the knowledge. May that be truly said of us, and all of us. And so, as Tiny Tim observed,
God bless us, everyone.